Hi everyone, my goal in this video is just to give you a short introduction to what we're going to be doing in class over the next couple of days. It's a more challenging topic, and a lot of times students struggle the most with this compared to the multiplying and dividing that we did the past couple of days. So I just want to give you kind of an overview of a couple of things, and then we'll spend a lot more time on it in class the next day or two. So first, before you write anything down on that half sheet that I gave you in class, for example 1 here where you're multiplying two fractions, we talked about this the past couple of days just as a review. You know, you really have two options here. You could just multiply across and say 4 times 3 is 12. You could do 9 times 5 and get 45, and then you could reduce it from there. And both of those numbers you could divide by 3, and you would end up getting 4 over 15 as your answer. Others of you may have noticed that you could just, cross off the 9 here and the 3 here, and that would reduce to 1/3. Then you would do 4 times 1 and 3 times 5 and get that answer directly. Now, in number 2, when we're adding these fractions together, we can't just add across. This is where we need to come up with an LCD, or a least common denominator, and that would be the smallest number that both 9 and 5 go into. So if you kind of think through multiples of 9 there, you would eventually come up with 45. And you would say, okay, I need to multiply the 9 by what it's missing, which would be a 5. Also multiply the numerator by 5. And then you'd multiply the 5 by what it's missing, which would be a 9. And then you would go from there. You would get 20 over 45 plus 27 over 45. And then add the numerators together, and you would get 47 over 45. But it is more work involved with adding, because you have to get that least common denominator. So what I'm going to do is, we're not going to actually complete the process of adding these together, but we are going to come up with what the least common denominator would be if we were to add these two together. And then in class we'll actually go through the process of multiplying by what it's missing, coming up with our final answer there. Now, when you're looking to add and subtract and you want a least common denominator, your first step is going to be to look at our two denominators and factor anything that needs to be factored. So in number 1 here, we're going to factor out a 4x, and then that would leave us with x minus 3. And then if we look at this 10x squared, that's as far as we can go. So when we're looking for our least common denominator, we want to make sure that we include everything from that factor and then everything from that factor. We're going to kind of do this piece by piece here. So our least common denominator would be, we look at the 4 and the 10, and the smallest number that both of those go into would be 20. So we know that 20 has to be part of our least common denominator. Then next we're looking at the x and the x squared. Well, this one's a little bit easier to work with, because if we need our least common denominator to include all of that, well, I need to include at least one x here and at least 2 x's here. So to take care of both of those, I could include an x squared in my least common denominator. Now, that takes care of the 4, it takes care of the x, it takes care of the 10, it takes care of the x squared. I also need to include this x minus 3 in my least common denominator. And I'm going to leave it there for this question for right now. So tomorrow we'll be looking at, okay, what would this first fraction be missing in its denominator? And we'll do something like, okay, we'd have to multiply it by a 5 to get it to 20. We'd have to multiply it by 1x to get it to that x squared. And then it already has the x minus 3. So we'll work with multiplying by that. And then we would look at the second fraction here and say, okay, to get from the 10 to the 20, I would need to multiply it by 2. The x squared it already has. It does not have the x minus 3, and so I would multiply by that to get a common denominator and then be able to add those together. But again, don't worry too much about that right now. Okay, so going to problem number 2, again, first step is we're going to factor the denominators. So looking at the first one, I would need two numbers that multiply to negative 12, add to 4. Those two numbers would be positive 6 and negative 2. So this one will factor into x plus 6, x minus 2. And then that second denominator, I can pull out a GCF of 3, and I would have x minus 2. Okay, so now to get my least common denominator, the first thing I normally do is look at the numbers in front. So we have a 1, really, and a 3, so the least common denominator for 1 and 3 would be 3. Then I'm going to need to include x plus 6 in my least common denominator. I'm also going to need to include x minus 2. And if we kind of go through and check everything, the x plus 6 is taken care of. That's in my least common denominator. The x minus 2 is taken care of. The 3 is taken care of. And the x minus 2 is taken care of. So that would be my least common denominator. Okay, and then moving on to number 3, again, we'll factor. So in that first denominator, I can take a GCF out of 2, which would give me x squared minus 25. I can then go further with that and factor it into 2x plus 5, x minus 5. And then the second denominator here, I would need two numbers that multiply to 25, add to 10, which would be x plus 5 and x plus 5, which I'm going to leave it like that. I'll show you how I write it in the least common denominator here in a second. Okay, so for the least common denominator, looking at those numbers in front, I definitely want a 2 in there. It's 2 and 1, so 2 would be the least common denominator for that. I need to include the x plus 5, and then I need to include the x minus 5. Now, that takes care of obviously everything in that first fraction, but now I need to look at this. We have 1x plus 5 here. That's taken care of already. But then I have this extra x plus 5. Because this second denominator includes 2x plus 5s, I need to include 2x plus 5s in my least common denominator, and I can do that just by putting a squared on that. And so that would be my least common denominator. And again, if you kind of look what's missing here, this first fraction would be missing 1 of the x plus 5. So tomorrow we'll work with the fact that you would multiply that by x plus 5. This fraction is missing the 2. It has both of the x plus 5s. It's also missing an x minus 5. So we'll work with that. Now, what I would like you to do is, for number 4, go ahead and try that one. Submit your answer for the LCD, for the least common denominator, on the form back on my website. And then I will see you in class. We'll go over this again. I know it can be a little confusing figuring out what to get in there. Then we'll go through the process of actually adding and subtracting these together and ending up with a single fraction. All right, I will see you in class.